Hola y bienvenidos a Viva Spanish, the podcast. Pues mira, look, here I am recording a podcast. First episode I'm going to call Who Am I? Because I'm not really sure who I am, who this person that's there recording himself a podcast is. But when I do think about who I am, first and foremost, I'm a husband and father. 3 kids, beautiful wife, love my family to bits. And I really am not sure who this person recording the podcast is. But I tell you what, one thing I'm not is a worrier. When I was growing up, I was always told, whatever happens, it's for the best. And I think that's pretty much shaped me into who I am now. That's nothing like any of my family, my parents, grandparents, all worriers. Now, I know this because between my second and third years at uni, where I studied sport development and coaching, I went across to the States. And I went across to coach soccer, or el fútbol, and it was amazing. I loved every moment of it. And in 3 months, I'd visited 15 states. Some of them, granted, were only just to sort of spend a night in a Motel 6 on the way to somewhere else, or to stop off at a Wendy's or an IHOP or whatever it is. Nowadays, I feel like an IHOP, the International House of Pancakes, would make a great apple skipping rope. Anyway, while I was out there, I made a contact in Long Island, and they were the McCaffrey family, and the McCaffreys are an absolutely incredible bunch of people, and they gave me the chance to live in with them and coach their daughter's football team weekly. I think there were maybe 2 or 3 sessions a week. So that's what I went out to do. I miss you guys, by the way. Os echo de menos, McCaffreys. After to and fro for 8 or 9 months, because I didn't have a visa, I had to keep coming back to the UK and going again. I ended up back in Lincoln. And I ended up back coaching football at Boston United Centre of Excellence. And that was pretty much what I was doing before I left. Now, when I look back at my childhood, and apologies for to-ing and fro-ing a little bit in this case with my story, I look back at least now and think that really there wasn't much to aspire to. Not living in Lincoln. The pinnacle of the jobs and careers that you knew of, or at least that I knew of, and that I could see in and around my life, were lawyers or barristers, architects, doctors, I don't know, bankers, something like that. And it feels very limited because they were the high-flying jobs, they were the jobs that paid, etc., etc. They were the successful people. And I never really knew that there were jobs like, I don't know, film producers and, I don't know, creative directors. I don't know who I thought produced the films or whether I thought they produced themselves, but it was never really a consideration. Anyway, going back to after returning from the States. I got back after Thanksgiving that year and spent the December to February, like I said, back at Boston United coaching. And as it happened, one of the schools that I was going into when I was coaching through the daytimes with Lincoln City football in the community, as it was back then, they asked me if I'd be able to go and teach for them doing a teacher training position because they saw something in me, I guess, that they thought would make a good teacher. Now, back then it was called a GTP. That's where you got paid while you studied and learned to be a teacher. So at that point in time, it looked like my path was laid out ahead of me. However, that job started in the September and it was now only mid to late February. So I had a little bit of time to kill. Now, my younger sister, whose name's Chloe, and this was back in 2007, she wanted to do a summer job abroad, like repping or PR for a nightclub or a bar or something similar. And she really didn't know how to go about finding the information that she'd need. So she asked me if I'd help her out, which I did. And we went down to the local library with a notepad and pen. And this is where we could use the internet for free. Wow. So not something people would need to consider nowadays. Anyway, when I typed in jobs in Spain, something popped up saying, are you a native English speaker? Do you have a degree? Do you want to earn 1,500 euros per month? And my answers were, sí. Well, they weren't, because at that time I don't even think I knew how to say yes in Spanish. Anyway, I sent my CV off, etc., and they replied, offering me an interview for the following Thursday. Now, a little bit of context. I just finished my degree. I didn't really earn very much money over in the States. I bounced around doing bits and pieces, and I had an overdraft of £1,250 at the time. And on that overdraft, I only had about £150 available to me. I'll let you do the maths, but obviously it wasn't really my money I was spending. I wasn't in a position to go and do this interview, so I booked it anyway. By the time I'd paid for that, in terms of the flights, I had around £27 to my name. Now, thankfully, I'd met a great guy when I was at uni called Diego, fantastic football player, and I met him playing in the university football team. And he was living in Madrid at the time. And I'd reached out to him and just said, any chance that I could spend a night or two at your place while I interview? And he said yes. So that was accommodation sorted. So there it was. Me, cabin bag with a cheap suit, shirt and tie in, pair of shoes, my passport. I got a lift down to Stansted to fly on the Wednesday, the day before the interview, and off I went. Now, on the Thursday, I rocked up at the Torres de Europa. Now, they're the famous slanted skyscrapers of the Madrid skyline. And I went up to the correct floor to do my interview. And that evening, I received a phone call saying that they'd love to work with me, they'd love to get me on board, and could I start on Monday for the training? And I said, yeah, no problem. So as soon as I got off the phone with them, I got on the phone to my mum and arranged for her to send my sister over with my clothes. After agreeing to the job, I found out I still had more than 3 weeks until the payday. And the £27 that I'd mentioned before, that hadn't gone up at all. I hadn't found any money, I hadn't been sent any money. That was still at 27, possibly a little less, logically a little less. Now, I remember Diego telling me that the best option would be to get a monthly travel pass, as it works out cheaper. But I didn't have enough money. I think it was 31 euros. So literally, I couldn't have bought one if I'd wanted to, not to mention the fact that that literally would have rendered me unable to eat. So every day, instead of getting the bus to the train station, which is what I needed to do in order to get into the city, I walked. Now, most people wouldn't even dream of walking it. Believe it or not, it does get cold in the mountains of Madrid, even in February. And it was about a 45-minute walk, but it was literally that or eat. If I'd got the bus, the money that I was able to spend on food would have been gone. Fortunately for me, my first teaching gig happened to be reasonably close to where I was living at the time with Diego. So after a week of training, needing to get that train into the city centre, I could walk to my commute. It was about an hour's walk still, but I didn't need public transport. I could go without that cost. Anyway, that first weekend, I went to the supermarket when I knew that I was going to be crashing at Diego's for a bit longer. And I just thought to myself, I need to buy the most economical meal or food, as it turned out to be, as possible. So I bought myself a 5-kilogram bag of pasta for a couple of euros and the biggest bottle of water that was available. As the change in water from UK to Spain was causing some gastric distress, shall we say. Now, Spaniards will tell you, the water in Spain is fantastic, and it really is. I got used to it in the end, but that initial swap over was causing me discomfort, and others around me, I would guess. Sorry about that. I mean, the Madrileños will tell you that their water is the best in Spain, and you should give their water from the tap to newborn babies. It's that filtered and clean and whatnot, and I'm sure that's true. So, well done in Madrid. So yeah, pasta and water. Now, in order to bring the pasta to life, or at least give it some sort of flavour, I was going to McDonald's every couple of days and just grabbing a handful of sachets of ketchup, or maybe I'd change it with barbecue sauce or something along those lines. But yeah, that was me. Now, I remember Diego, after a few days, preparing a steak and asparagus meal with some new potatoes, and I think it was purely out of pity. I mean, he was a good guy, very generous, very kind guy, but I remember him making this meal for me, and I thought, wow, I must be living a real sad existence if he feels that he needs to cook something for me. But I appreciate that, Diego. Thank you. Now, as you can imagine, living in a place with other young, early 20-year-old males, there were parties. And thankfully for me, these guys were house party kind of people. So they'd get crates of beers in, they'd invite me to the beers, as they say in Spanglish. And it meant I didn't have to spend any money, but I could still have a good time with the lads. Now, this was hard for me because I have always been a very social person, and I don't like the idea of getting that reputation of being the person that ducks out of their rounds and is always at the toilet when it's their turn, or even worse, has already gone home. But these parties were my first real experience with Spanish. And speaking of the lads, let me just say that these lads took their opportunity with both hands to be lads regarding me. They were coming up to me and they were telling me that I needed to talk to girls and that chúpame la polla was a good way to open a conversation. Now, I'm going to let you go ahead and Google that one if you're not sure, because I don't want my first episode to be vulgar, shall we say. Anyway, the other thing I didn't get was why they were telling me when people asked, ¿Hablas español? Do you speak Spanish? I was always told to answer with un poquito, like a tiny bit. But the truth was simply no. I wasn't even able to say no, nada, which would have obviously been a contradiction by its nature, with nada meaning nothing. But yeah, they wouldn't even insist on an honest answer in that way. They were making me say that I spoke a little Spanish, but I really didn't. I didn't speak anything. I knew how to say I spoke a little Spanish, and that was it. So after a couple of weeks at Diego's, he reminded me that me sleeping on his bedroom floor couldn't be a permanent arrangement, and thankfully for me, payday was almost upon me. And a guy that I did some training with, and I actually was going to work in Orange for my first teaching gig, had a flat going. And it was him and his girlfriend that had the place, and they wanted to get a person in for the spare room that they had. He was from London, she was from Peru, but her English was incredible, near perfect. Now the trouble with that was, it meant I was working in English, living my home life in English, and socialising with native English speakers, my colleagues from work, in Irish pubs. Needless to say, I didn't get very far with Spanish, and after a few months, when it came time to return to the UK to go back to the GTP that I'd had set up for me, I didn't go. I just didn't go. And it was my bad that I should have let them know, but I'm pretty sure that with there being no correspondence for a good while, they were expecting that to be the case. Anyway, after about 10 months of being in Madrid, I did take a long, hard look in the mirror, and I was extremely ashamed at how pathetic my Spanish was. So I moved into a flat with a student of mine called Fernando. Now, Fernando is from Jerez, or Jerez, and the accent in Andalusia is most comparable to that of Geordie or Scouse to us British people. Now, that was a baptism of fire. And the truth is, if you can understand an Andaluz, who eats the letters, as they say in Spanglish, you can understand anyone. So that's where I got to. A couple of years living with Fernando, and I'd come on leaps and bounds. And other social situations developed too. So I'd made good friends with a guy called Dan, who I worked with, another guy Matteo, another guy Vitali, his friend Pablo, and we were socializing together. Now, Dan was American, and he was my interpreter for the most part. Matteo, bilingual, Colombian by birth, and then he grew up in North America. Vitali as well, bilingual. Pablo was almost all Spanish, but thanks to, like I say, the other guys, and I relied heavily on Dan in particular, he'd be my interpreter. So I didn't feel like I couldn't be myself with those guys, because anything I wasn't sure of, I'd just say in English, and I'd be representing myself. And that's what I did find hard, though, when I was solely with Spanish speakers, because naturally I'm quite an extroverted person, and if I'm sitting there silently at the dinner table while everyone else around me is having a good time and making jokes, I'm not being me. And one of the other social situations that I found myself in was playing football for Spanish teams at this point, and it's very similar to in England. When you're in that dressing room, if you're different, you're getting it. You're getting attacked. You're the butt of every joke, and I wasn't prepared to be that person, so I dug in, developed my Spanish, reached a level where I could at least defend myself from these jokes. And a couple of things that I found really helped, very strangely, with my progress, aside from having very patient and very helpful friends, were The Simpsons, The Alchemist, and actually a third thing was the Spanish football newspapers. Now the first two was because I knew them like the back of my hand. I was a very big fan of Los Simpsons growing up, and I'd seen every episode probably a handful of times at least. So that was something I was happy to have on the TV despite not understanding the words that were being spoken. Because what my brain was doing was recalling the dialogue from having seen it before in English, and was working at piecing that information together with these new sounds to make sense of them in parallel. At least that's what I think was going on. Then there's The Alchemist, which is a book by Paulo Coelho. And that's one of my favorite books, and I've read it a few times. That was a very similar situation too. I'd read the words previously, so I knew the story, I was familiar with pretty much what was going on at what stage in the book, chapter by chapter, and I could deduce for the most part what the words were meaning. But then anything that I couldn't figure out, I'd get the old dictionary out, like literally the dictionary with pages that I would need to flick through and search alphabetically for words, not word reference. I think that was the first big thing that came out. And anyway, I remember oveja being a word that I had to look for, meaning sheep, and estaba. Now that really threw me. Estaba is a past form of the verb to be. Then another passion, as I've mentioned previously, being football. Lots of time spent twiddling my thumbs, long commutes as my hours went up. I was splashing out €1 per day on buying Marca, the biggest of the Spanish football newspapers. Now I recall a particular saga that I was really interested in following, being the signing of Cristiano Ronaldo para Real Madrid. And I was trying to work out what was going on by reading about it. And similarly to The Alchemist, I could make sense of chunks of text, but the odd word or phrase would throw me out. So, it is what it is. I needed to look for words in the dictionary. I was needing to go and spend that time, invest in that in order to progress my Spanish language skills. And one word in particular from that I can recall is fichaje, meaning signing. One other way of developing some fluency that I used was to do a running commentary of my life. Now it sounds really dull and really boring, and it was, especially initially when my vocabulary was limited. But that was my baseline, so I knew that the first day I decided I was going to do that, when I was walking to the metro, looking around, I'd recall palabras sueltas, like odd words, like tienda, meaning shop, or coche, meaning car. But then as time went on, I realized I was saying more. For example, es una tienda cara, it's an expensive shop, or es un coche rojo, it's a red car. And in the end, I was cooking in the kitchen, and I was saying things like, estoy preparando las verduras, hirviendo el agua y asando el pollo. So I was there and I was explaining to myself, I'm preparing the vegetables, boiling the water, roasting the chicken. So I was effectively controlling my inner monologue. I was dictating to myself what my thoughts would be. And the fact of the matter is, I've never had a Spanish class. And that's not a humble brag, that's me saying that I've probably learnt it the most natural way, by being immersed in it, and I've learnt like a child would, because I've interpreted the situations around me, and I've been able to deduce from the familiarity of the words that have been spoken in those situations what they must mean. Now, I've never felt the need to know the whys and the what-fors regarding the grammar. I never did at school, with French, and I haven't to this day in Spanish. And I'm 99% sure that nearly all of the Spanish grammar that I do know now, and I would say that I am expert with Spanish grammar, has been through teaching English to Spaniards and recognizing the Spanglish that these Spanish people would use. For example, I would hear, I want to go to the restaurant for to dinner this Saturday. And I'm thinking to myself, what have they said? And I'd put it back into Spanish, and it was, quiero ir al restaurante para cenar el sábado. Like, of course. Now, some people would argue that 8 years in Madrid would logically render my Spanish that of an 8-year-old. But I disagree, because I didn't spend the first 18 months learning how to shape my mouth to make sounds. So I would consider it to be that of at least a 9.5-year-old. And there you have it. That was that. I was living and working in Madrid at that point in 2007. That job, in fact, was teaching English to Spanish speakers in companies, corporate stuff, and during my time working at this company, I taught English as a foreign language to some of the top people in advertising, marketing, PR, negotiations, etc., etc. And some of the companies were Orange, Vodafone, Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and there were others that I can't recall the name of right now. Well, anyway, after 6 years of doing that, I was bored and wanted to get back to what I knew I enjoyed, and that was teaching children. So I halved my salary, doubled my stress by working in one of the top private schools in Spain. It was one of the schools that the Beckhams lived nearby. So you can imagine that it was quite an expensive school, and the clientele were rather demanding. Anyway, after a couple of years of that, I decided that I did enjoy the teaching in a school side of that job, and I thought that I'd return home to the UK to get the UK PGCE, which I felt would have more value internationally if I decided to go back to Spain again or move around to somewhere else. So I came back to Lincoln to do it. So anyway, after a couple of years of being back in the UK, an old mate of mine got in touch about me tutoring him to help him get to where he wants to be in preparation for him retiring in Spain in the future. Now, he would have probably been 33 at the time, something like that. So I thought, right, we've got a good 25 years if he takes early retirement to get him to where he wants to be. So whether it's that in a year's time he's bilingual or he's learnt 5 words per lesson during that time, he's going to be happy. He's further on than he would have been if he hadn't had the lessons at all. So I thought, you know what, we'll take a punt, see if he enjoys it. And he's been really supportive of this move, and he encouraged me to do it when he saw my disillusionment with being a full-time teacher. He's like, mate, go for it, you know, what is there to lose? As soon as word gets out that you're doing what you're doing, you'll have students coming out of your ears. There'll be too many for you to cope with. And he wasn't far wrong, and word is getting out, and it is spreading, and I am getting inquiries for lessons, you know, most weeks. So, you know, I've got to thank him a lot. And the truth is, these years that we've had working together have brought us to a point now where I genuinely feel we could go a whole lesson without speaking a word of English. From the moment I walk in the door, you know, the hola, ¿qué tal, tío? ¿Cómo estás? To the bueno, muchas gracias, hasta la próxima at the end, walking out, there's no need for us to speak in English. Now, the fact of the matter is, we became friends at 11 years old, went all the way through secondary school together, college together, and our default language is English. So, you know, when the opportunity for an anecdote or a joke, a bit of banter comes up, then we'll flick back to English and we'll take the opportunity, but then we'll straight back into Spanish again. And this is something that he can do really well. You know, he's one of these people that does have a knack for it, being able to flick between the languages, and that's something that a lot of people say they want to be able to do with their language skills further down the line, that they see me being able to say something in Spanish, explain it in English, and go back and forth. But, you know, it's something that if I can do, anybody can do. 7 years of primary school teaching in the UK, and I'd realised that I'd lost a lot of motivation towards it, a lot of the passion and the drive I had for being a teacher. And basically that's due to the priorities of schools, and I don't blame the schools, I blame the Department for Education, being so far misaligned with mine that I didn't want to run my own class anymore. So at that point I handed my resignation in, only to be told that they didn't want to lose me, and how would I feel about going part-time and just teaching PE and Spanish, the 2 subjects that I feel most passionate about. And I thought, actually, that's a very good compromise. It reduced my financial risk of stepping away from teaching completely and not getting any sort of a salary, while still affording me the opportunity to grow a Spanish language academy, which had become my plan, my goal, my new dream. And that is when Viva Spanish was born. 8 months in, and now I'm teaching 20 plus adults weekly, another 20 plus children. I've got about 30 hours of classes a week. I'm collaborating with a tech guy to get an app launched, creating worksheets and lesson content all the time. I'm looking to find someone, actually, if you know of anyone, let me know, get in touch, to run some sessions under the Viva Spanish brand. I have someone on board to support me with my marketing, and now here I am, lining up content ideas and running a podcast. A good question for me to ask myself at this point is, why do I think people might be interested in listening to me on a podcast? So I thought, I need to consider what I think you guys will get out of it. Now, I'm loving podcasts at the moment, meaning the last year or so, I'm really addicted. I've just always got a podcast on. And mainly I listen to them for entertainment. Some have educational value, some don't. But all of them entertain. And what I think you'll get from my podcast is entertainment. Now, I want you to get some insights from people that have lived through a Spanish language journey of their own, or maybe even just part of one. Maybe they're at the beginning of theirs. Maybe they've been at it for a while. And some of these people will also have been present for a part or all of mine, because when I arrived in Spain, not knowing how to say yes, the words I did have were hola, por favor, and gracias. And that's exactly how I would have said them. I want you to hear people discussing the apprehension that they have towards starting to learn Spanish for themselves, what their barriers are and the things that are stopping them, and then how others overcame their stumbling blocks, their apprehensions, their nerves and anxieties about getting started. So you'll be listening to some of the people that I teach, you'll be listening to some of the people that I met when I was working and living in Spain. And what I can promise you is along the way there will be a lot of laughs, there will be lots of stories and anecdotes, and I am 100% certain that I will be made to feel very embarrassed. The guests that I'll bring on that discuss my Spanish learning journey will make sure of that, because believe me, there are some corkers at the beginning. And you'll get to know me and my Viva Spanish circle. So this podcast episode of Who Am I feel it needs to be, who am I? Who is this person? Who have I become? And I guess that now, in a short answer, I am Viva Spanish Lee. Viva Spanish Lee on Instagram, Viva Spanish Lee on Facebook, so give me a follow. And that is who I am. La próxima vez, más y mejor.